Hello everyone, this is Miss Dean, and I'd like to welcome you to our first screencast of the new unit that is our living world. We will begin AP Environmental looking at how different organisms in our environments work together and how they relate to one another and how all of that energy and matter is cycled through our ecosystems. So we're going to start with eat or be eaten. First of all, we have to look at where we and other organisms get our food, and that can be broken down into two basic categories. Producers produce their own food, they make their own food. Usually, we think of plants. They do photosynthesis. They take solar energy and turn that into carbohydrates, into sugar, and more complex carbohydrates that can be broken down. We also have something called chemosynthesis. That means you're making energy or making chemicals, you're making compounds, organic compounds from the surrounding chemicals. That's usually found in bacteria, and we usually see it in places like ocean vents or extreme environments. Another word for producer, a word you should know, is autotroph. Auto meaning self, and troph meaning energy. When you put that two together, that means they're making their own energy. Our second major group is the consumer. Just like it sounds, consumers have to get their energy from somewhere else. They consume it. Another word for that is heterotroph. Hetero meaning different, and troph meaning energy. So they're getting their source from somewhere else. Those two are going to work together to cycle energy through our ecosystem. Within our consumers, we have three different kinds, and hopefully this is all review for you guys. We have herbivores that only eat plants, so things like rabbits and deer and small birds that eat seeds and things. We have carnivores that only eat meat, like lions, jaguars, some types, like a polar bear is definitely a carnivore. And then we have omnivores. Omnivore eats both plants and animals. So the brown bears and black bears that are common, or especially black bears around here, are omnivores. They spend most of their time eating fruits and berries, and then will occasionally venture out and eat some meat when they can get their hands on it. Within those types of carnivores, within those types of consumers, we have three different levels, okay? The primary consumer, or the first consumer, is always going to be a herbivore. That's something that eats the first level, okay? Then we have our secondary consumer. Our secondary consumer is going to eat the primary consumer. It's our second level. And finally, the tertiary. The tertiary means third, so our third level consumer, or tertiary consumer, is going to eat other kinds of animals. So in this example, I have a actual food chain. We have rabbits that are eating grass and flowers. Those are eaten by snakes. That would be our secondary consumer. And then our eagle, that is our tertiary consumer. When I take that food chain and I stack all of the other organisms on it that live in that ecosystem, I get a food web. A food web is going to show all the different food chains all together in one community. They also are going to display things like our scavengers, our detritivores. Okay, detritivore is something that eats dead material, usually breaking down things like dead leaves or dead animals. We also have, scavengers are going to eat dead material as well, but we also have our bacteria living in the soil, and these guys are decomposers. Okay, all three of those are big components in a food web. And if you look here, we're starting off our cones and seeds. That is a producer that comes from our plant. So is the grass and roots. And these two together are going to form the basis of this food web. Our secondary level, our primary consumer is going to be things like our insects and beetles, the Arctic hare, and in some cases our black bear, okay? Because remember, they are omnivores. They do eat plants. And our little squirrel here. Our secondary consumer is anything that's going to eat those primary consumers. So we have our snowy owl here that's eating the Arctic hare. We have the bear again is eating our lemming here, and the Arctic fox is eating our lemming. We also have the badger. Okay, the lemming gets picked on a good bit. Our third level, or tertiary or top consumer, is going to be anything that's going to eat the secondary consumers. So if our weasel is our secondary consumer, we have the red-tailed hawk up here as our tertiary consumer. Even though this one's kind of spread out here, this guy's all the way over here where we have all these other secondary and tertiary consumers. If you look back, he's eating grass and roots, which means he is actually a primary consumer. Okay, so don't let that confuse you. You have to follow the arrows. Speaking of the arrows, what does this mean? Okay, why do they always point this way? The reason for that is the arrows represent the flow of energy. Okay, they're taking the energy from our plants and going into our animals, taking the energy from my squirrel and going into the red-tailed hawk. The way to keep this straight when you're drawing your own food web is to think about what direction the food is going. So the squirrel goes into the hawk's mouth. Here my lemming is going into my bear's mouth. Okay, that's how I keep it straight. But please keep in mind that this is always following our energy flow through the system. Okay. If you notice, this one doesn't show it quite as well as I would like, but our soil and dirt and all of those nutrients, yes, they're going to our earthworm, but as these things die, as our top tertiary consumers die, they are broken down by bacteria. So we could actually draw another arrow. If I put bacteria over here, I could draw another arrow going this way to show that those are broken down by our detritivores and by our decomposers. The next thing we have to consider with this is the law of conservation of matter. Okay, hopefully you've heard of the law of conservation of energy, but in this one, the basic thing, or the basic point I want to make, is that matter cannot be created or destroyed except in very, very special circumstances. So when we look at matter in our ecosystem, okay, first of all, matter, if you don't remember, is the stuff that makes up everything you look at. Those are the atoms and the compounds that make up who we are and who everything is in our ecosystem. So instead of being destroyed when an animal dies, it changes form. Okay? It's also true of energy. Energy is not created or destroyed in an ecosystem. Instead, it just passes from one trophic level or one energy level to another. So as we go up the food chain, that energy is going to move to the next level, but it is an extremely inefficient process. Most of the energy that's passed from one level to another is never passed on. Most of that energy is lost, and we'll look at that in just a second. One term I do want you to be familiar with is the net primary productivity, or the NPP. This is the amount of energy that plants make and pass on to herbivores in the ecosystem. It is calculated by taking the amount of the sugar, amount of the carbohydrate that the plants can make in 1 year, and subtracting from that the amount that they need to be able to live. Okay, plants make sugar at an enormous rate, but most of that sugar they're actually using. They can't, they don't make it just for food for everyone else. They're making it so that they can survive. So we subtract that from the total that the plants can make. We measure the NPP in kilocalories per meter squared per year. Okay. Please keep in mind when we look at energy later on, our net primary productivity is only going to measure the energy produced by the plants. Okay. In most ecosystems, this is an extreme limiting resource. A limiting resource is anything that limits how much productivity that group can have. Okay, so it limits the growth of a population. This should make a lot of sense to you, because if we really look at an ecosystem, if we don't have a lot of plants, that means we're not going to have a lot of animals either. So there's only so much energy being produced at the plant level, at the producer level, so our consumers are very, very limited. A great example of this is a desert. If you go to a desert and look around, there aren't that many plants around. And because of that, there are very few animals that can survive. There's just not enough energy in that system. Along with our energy or movement, okay, I told you we'd come back to this, we have something called the 10% rule. As a rule, when one organism eats another, only 10% of the available energy in that level is passed on to the next level. So just with our NPP back here, okay, I told you that most of the energy, or that we take the total energy that the plants make and subtract the amount that they need to live, well, that usually comes to about 10%. 90% of the energy produced by the plants is lost. It's used to let the organism grow and reproduce, and eventually it's turned into heat energy and it's completely lost, or it's lost to the environment. 10% is passed on. That's true of every trophic level. Okay, so every time my bunny eats some grass, he gets 10% of the available energy in that grass. Every time a snake eats that rabbit, he gets 10% of the energy available in that rabbit. Okay? So what does this mean for us? We can put each of the trophic levels, okay? Here's my producer level, my primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer, into a pyramid structure. The reason we use a pyramid is because as we go up these trophic levels, biomass actually goes down. Biomass is the amount of living material, living matter in an ecosystem. There is always going to be more plants, more producers in any ecosystem than there will be animals. That's why our plants go on this bottom level. There's always going to be more bugs and more primary consumers and more bunnies than there are our predators, our secondary consumers. And the top predators, really very few of them live in one ecosystem at a time. And that's because of the available energy in this system. Okay? So as an example, let's say my producers are able to make 10 or 100,000 kilocalories of energy in a year. Okay, so we're making that much energy. That's quite a bit of energy. But our primary consumers only have 10,000 kilocalories per year. That's 10% of the available energy from my producer level being passed up to this level. My next level, hopefully you can see where this is going, is only going to be 1,000 kilocalories per level or per year. So very few, very small amount of energy, fewer animals can live at this level. And finally, my tertiary consumer, here I only have 100 kilocalories per year. So very, very few organisms are going to be able to live in this tertiary level. When we look at this, okay, think about how much food it takes. This owl is a carnivore. He doesn't eat plants. But if we look at humans, humans are omnivores. We eat plants and animals. If we look at how much energy is available to us from the plant level versus our primary consumer and our secondary consumer, you can see why most of the energy in all ecosystems is going to have to come from the bottom level. We do get an enormous amount of energy from our secondary consumer level when we eat protein, fish and poultry and red meat, but it takes not only the energy here, but also all of the energy from these plants to make those organisms. And we're going to talk a good bit about how that energy is passed on and what that means to the agricultural industry when we get to our soil and agriculture level. So hopefully this makes a good bit of sense to you. I will have a list of vocabulary for you to look at tomorrow when you come to class or the next day you come to class on this particular unit. I would go ahead and look up the two terms bioaccumulation and biomagnification. We will have a lab tomorrow dealing with those two topics. So hopefully you enjoyed our first video, and I hope there are many more to come. Thank you.